Hi everyone. Welcome to the last weekly lecture. This is the last one, even though it's week 14, because next week, which I have listed as week 15, we're going to just have off, because I think that you all probably would appreciate time to be able to work on your final papers, to be able to turn in any extra credit or anything like that you might have left. I want you all to have time to be able to work on that stuff, right? And we had spring break. That was the 16th week. I didn't count it for the purposes of my schedule. So yeah, that's a wrap on the entire semester. And so what we're going to do with this last session is we're going to try to fill in a little bit more detail of Kant's picture. Especially, we're going to try to clarify the nature of Kant's formal or transcendental idealism, right? And we're going to try to especially pay attention to the points where Kant has felt like his reviewers, his readers, have misunderstood him. And we're going to end by trying to clarify the specifics of Kant's position by contrasting him with Leibniz, right? Okay. So, to begin with, what you've read for this week is just sort of the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason. And in the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant sort of lays out really the program for what he calls critical philosophy. And essentially, everything after Kant, in some way, responds to this critical intervention, right? In this way, like a lot of people frame it in such a way that there's no going back behind Kant, that Kant has somehow changed the way that we do philosophy now, right? And part of the way that Kant has done that is through what he calls the intervention of a critical method. And this critical method requires what he calls a Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? And there's so much to unpack with that metaphor, right? I mean, part of it is just really the recognition that it was sort of Copernicus in some way, Copernican science, Galilean science, right, that formed sort of the basis for modern science, right? And so Kant has this conception of physics where physics really begins to become genuinely scientific with Copernicus and with a number of these figures, like Galileo and Newton and so on, that really have a mathematical approach to physics, right? And part of what was involved was overcoming a Ptolemaic, I think that's right, model of the universe, right? So they had to, sort of develop a mathematical model for heliocentric understanding of the galaxy, right? And so this required us to really shift our perspectives, right? To realize that we are sort of like observers within the physical world. We are not the center of the physical world, right? And that to understand the truth means in some ways to understand the displacement of our own perspective, right? And so Kant has this vision. Kant sort of asks, why is it that metaphysics has not made the same sort of scientific progress as has been made in mathematics and physics, right? And this is a familiar gesture, right, from the Prolegomena. That's how Kant opens that text as well. And so Kant imagines that just as there were sort of momentous leaps forward in physics with figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, and that there were similar enormous strides in mathematics with figures like Descartes and analytic geometry, Leibniz and Newton with the calculus, right? Kant envisions that there really should be some sort of equivalent massive leap in progress in philosophy, and especially in the most important area of philosophy, at least in some respect, and that is metaphysics, right? Why has metaphysics not yet become a science? And I would like to say again, just for clarification, that here science, the German word is Wissen or Wissenschaft, which is like to know something in a theoretical sense. And so the sense for scientific is not like, we think about like the scientific method or something like that that's peculiar to perhaps the hard sciences, right? Instead, in German, the connotation for Wissenschaft is just like a systemic form of inquiry, right? A kind of inquiry that doesn't kind of bottom out an opinion, right? But that, you can develop, a method for treating, right? And so one example of the difference between how the Germans use the word Wissenschaft versus how we use the word science is that for them it would be perfectly appropriate, in certain circumstances to talk about like literary criticism as being a science, right? Because it has sort of an established method, it has a corpus, it has, generally recognized rules for procedure, etc., right? Okay, so that's enough for now on Wissenschaft, right? So when Kant says that, metaphysics has not yet become a science, what he's really saying is that we don't even have anything like a procedure for determining who is correct in metaphysical disputes, right? Not only are we uncertain about the conclusions of metaphysics, but in terms of the method, Kant sort of compares it to sort of like groping around in the dark, right? We don't know where we're going. We're not really oriented in our direction, right? We seem sometimes to have found some sort of insight, but we can't fully make out like its full implications or what exactly it means. And so that's what Kant means when he says that metaphysics is not yet a science, is that like in the same way that we might think of kind of pseudosciences as not really having a genuine scientific method, right? There's no sort of equivalent for metaphysics. There's no methodological a way of proceeding, right? And that's how we know, right, that it's kind of like basically a pseudoscience at this point, right? Perhaps it has found the occasional insight, but for the most part, it does not amount to a genuine form of knowledge. Okay. So what Kant suggests is that if we allow for what he calls this Copernican revolution in philosophy, then we will sort of accede to the appropriate perspective where a scientific treatment of philosophical topics become possible, right? Okay, so what is this revolution, right? What is Kant's revolution of philosophy? Why do we think of him as being the end of this period? Why is he such an important figure, right? Kant's Copernican revolution of philosophy is that objects of our experience conform to the form of our cognition. So objects conform to our cognition. So in other words, the objects that we perceive are somehow relative to our own perspective, right? And we're going to have to explain exactly how, right? Because you don't want to be too quick. You don't want to just characterize this as like, I don't know, a kind of subjectivism or something like that. Like Kant is saying that everything that appears is an illusion or something like that, right? He's going to explicitly say that that's not true of his philosophy, right? It's not that everything about the object comes from us. It's that certain essential salient features come from us, right? And so if we want a genuinely systematic philosophy, Kant says in the Prolegomena that we read last week that it's all or nothing, right? And what that means is to provide a genuinely satisfactory account of what Kant wants to say, which is that certain features of objects come from us, right? You know, you might think about the week that we did on primary and secondary qualities. Many people have drawn this as an analogy to talk about what Kant is saying, because Kant is saying that some features of objects stem entirely from our own subjective constitution, right? But if that information is to be useful at all, then we need to be able to, on a principled basis, be able to sift out the features of objects that really belong to the objects that we see, and those features that, you know, are sort of necessary features of how we must cognize them, right? And so one way that Kant characterizes his own project, I've written here, is he endeavors to limit our knowledge to make room for, I think he uses faith instead of belief, but faith or belief, right? So he's going to sort of say that we can't have knowledge about things that are outside of our possible experience, right? And so related to this claim that it's all or nothing is this related claim that the critique or the critical approach is sort of akin to a trial, right? A tribunal. We're going to sort of determine the rightful claims of each of our capabilities, right? To determine in a systematic way what we're really capable of. Quick historical footnote. Right? Important to keep in mind that Germany at this point is not a unified state, right? And so, you know, it's sort of the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire, which means that, German-speaking sort of principalities are divided up, and the language is not exactly the same, and the laws are certainly not the same, right? Like lands are just sort of like, there's just like a feudal lord, right? That's there, and you're subject to like extreme forms of nepotism, right? There's not really a reliable centralized state, right? And so you can kind of see the quintessentially German sort of idea here, right? Which is that we need some way to resolve the dispute between these various principalities, right? And this is sort of the political function that Kant envisioned his own critical system as having, right? Because philosophy, as he envisions it, sort of has the ability to dole out the correct responsibilities to each person, it has the ability to settle disputes, right? And this is why Kant was kind of like one of the great liberal thinkers of our time, right? Is because he envisioned the capacity of a philosophical standpoint to go and resolve disputes, right? And this is, part of the reason why Kant is sort of cited as one of the intellectual forefathers of like the League of Nations and the United Nations, right? The idea that there's an international order that's not bound by local customs or traditions, right? That can play a role in navigating or negotiating these kind of disputes, right? And so you can kind of see how the political history of the German state, right, is directly connected with Kant's own vision of his own philosophy, right? And keep in mind, this is right around the time of the Enlightenment. In Germany, you have the printing press and so on. And so there's this sort of public fear over people reading too much, that people are reading too much, that this is making them commit suicide. They're citing famous books and literature around this period, specifically The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, right? And so there's this idea that books sort of, it's almost like the way that there's like a craze around cell phones now. Like we're on social media too much, and the social media is the reason why traditional forms of life are falling apart, right? There are basically these kind of worries, but about books, right? And that books sort of, share these like really profane kinds of knowledge and undermine social institutions and so on, right? And so, in the same way that there's a tension then between various German principalities, right? There's sort of a corresponding tension between kind of new Enlightenment idea, right, that emerges especially because of the Reformation and the printing press and so on. And Kant was very much a part of this. We read What is Enlightenment at the very beginning of the course, right? And he says it's our freedom from our self-imposed tutelage, right, or immaturity. And so, freedom, really being able to act for ourselves, to think over the traditions that we have instead of blindly accepting them, right? And you can kind of see how this resonates with this sort of internationalist kind of angle, right? Okay. And so that's just sort of to explain how this idea of a critique as a tribunal, it has very important sort of political context, right? Kant is not only claiming, I'm going to resolve the dispute between these German principalities, I'm going to resolve the central question of our times, which is, the amount of religious wars, etc., and toleration and so on in Europe. He says, I'm going to sort of provide an answer to that by showing that we don't have cognitive access to the true religion, right? There's no way that we can know that. There's no way that we can do enough metaphysics to justify, a Jewish conception of a God or, a specifically Catholic or a Protestant one and so on. We have to leave that entirely to belief, right? And so this is another aspect in which he's kind of a liberal thinker, and his own organization of his thought, even when it's around these kind of arcane topics like metaphysics and so on, epistemology, they're very rich and very deeply informed by his existing political situation, right? And so this is part of his aspiration, is that if we can determine the legitimate boundaries of our knowledge versus our belief, then we'll no longer get into these essentially political disputes, right, about religious belief. We won't get into the same sort of political disputes over border and territory and so on, because we'll have a legal system that's based in pure reason, right? So anyone that can reason about it will, be able to arrive at the correct conclusion, and, so on and so forth. And so that's sort of Kant's attitude. He's very much like a rules of principles kind of guy. And, he's kind of part of the reason why we think of that as being very deeply German. Okay, additional little side note because it's funny. Um, Kant is sort of part of why we have this conception of German culture as being very rules based, right? Um, and so on, right? That goes very much against the old sort of Roman way of thinking about the people in this area, right? They thought of these as sort of Teutonic barbarians, right? And so on. Um, and so, yeah, like, but Kant himself, because, this was the conception of Germans at that time, he claimed lineage to the Scottish Enlightenment, right? So to Hume and so on. That's really funny, right? There's actually a bunch of German philosophers, even though now, you might say, oh, I have German heritage or something like that. I try to make some vague allusion to, these really classical philosophers. For a lot of them, they lied about not being German, right? Nietzsche too, in the 19th century, he's another figure, example of someone who was German but sort of wanted to distance himself from his German identity. Okay, historical segue over with. I appreciate you indulging me for a moment. Okay. So Kant then says, okay, if we want to really have this critical system get off the ground, then what we need to do is we need a complete assessment of our cognitive faculties, right? And Kant says that there are three. There's the intuition, the understanding, and reason, right? And part of why Kant is so unique is that Kant insists that these are completely different cognitive sources that are bound by their own specific rules or principles, right? Think back to someone like Descartes or someone like Hume, right? For Descartes, reason, is the true way that we come to know things, right? And sensation, he would say, instead of intuition or perception, this is it's a very unclear and obscure kind of knowledge, right? So Descartes thought really that we only had one cognitive faculty, right? Reason. And then we had sort of like qualitatively greater or less, more clear and more distinct, and less clear and less distinct versions, right? Similarly, Hume, right? Hume also sort of thought the inverse. He thought that our intuitive knowledge was extremely rich and clear and, distinct and so on, and that our thoughts were just sort of pale images, repetitions, so on, of these things that we sensed, right? And so for Hume, thought merely follows upon our sensations. And so in that way, it's just the inverse of the picture that we get from Descartes, right? And so this is why Kant can claim that he resolves the central conflict between the rationalists and the empiricists, is that the rationalists correctly identify that we do have some a priori principles, right? That we don't just get from experience. But the empiricists are right that in the vast majority of cases, the rationalist has overextended the legitimacy of those principles, right? They've asserted it way too far, and we'll see how whenever we compare Kant to Leibniz, which we'll do sort of towards the end. And so we have three distinct cognitive sources. They do different things. They're organized by different principles. And we get different kind of synthetic a priori principles from each of them, kind of. We'll see. Okay. let's just go through the first one, intuition, right? This is the faculty of sensation. So intuition is where we are affected by stuff, right? You see the tissue box, the Whopper, whatever, right? And you are, as it says here, you're perceiving a particular thing, right? Why is this a source of knowledge? Well, because, like, this is actually what we use for the vast majority of our knowledge. We go out and we see things in the world, right? Okay. And so the synthetic a priori principles associated with this are related to space and time. Kant says space and time are forms of our intuition. So in other words, Kant doesn't think that like space and time really exist independently of our perspective, right? They merely define the necessary form under which I can sense anything at all, right? And so he's differing himself from like Newton, for example, who thought of space and time essentially as like a giant container, right? Everything is in space and time in the way that space and time are giant containers and things can be sort of inside of that, right? We think of kind of metaphorically. But for Kant, we don't have the ability to infer that space and time exist outside of our perception. We just know that it defines the form of our perception, right? So the synthetic a priori principle, we may know that everything is in space and in time, right? Simply in virtue of having the sort of cognitive faculty that we do. And so I can assert, for example, everything I sense will, be spatial and temporal, right? And that's a synthetic a priori principle. A priori because it extends into the future, right? It's universal, right? Synthetic because it genuinely amplifies my knowledge, right? To know that everything I sense will be in space and in time, right? And so there are certain features about space and time that we can always know because we're identifying necessary features about ourselves, right? And importantly for Kant, this is where we get all of our mathematical knowledge. That mathematical knowledge is really about the relationship of space and time, right? And you might recall in Descartes, right? Descartes said that bodies are extended, right? That's one way of saying that they are quantifiable, right? You can give a mathematical treatment of things in space, right? And so what is the source of our synthetic a priori knowledge of mathematics? Well, Kant's going to say, well, it comes from the faculty of our sensation. It comes from the form of our intuition, which is space and time. Right. This is why Kant thinks that you don't do math by knowing definitions of words, right? You don't do it analytically, right? And the reason why it amplifies our knowledge is because, we can then apply it to the spatio-temporal world, right? And so Kant claims that it's just wrong for Hume and Leibniz to claim that mathematical knowledge is analytic, right? For Kant, it must be synthetic because we're genuinely amplifying our knowledge. Okay, next cognitive faculty is the understanding. This is the faculty of rules, right? So I see something, and then to understand it is to be able to apply a concept to it, right? So I see a water bottle, I go red, right? That's one concept that I could use, or water bottle, right? Okay, and so cognition is where we correctly apply our understanding to objects given in intuition, right? That's what that case was. Something is given in our intuition, we apply a concept to it, and then we judge whether or not we applied that concept correctly. So this is why concepts are rules, right? They're rules for how to use them, right? Red, that concept says you should include everything of whatever color variation or whatever, right? Everything that shows up to you in that way counts as red. And so that's why Kant thinks of this as being the faculty of rules or the faculty of concepts. Now Kant says that there are certain concepts that are sort of essential to any concept at all, right? These are just the form of what it means to have a kind of conceptual knowledge. And Kant includes in his faculties, you'll have read them in the prolegomena last week, for example, things about substance and properties and things about causality, right? And so this is where we get the synthetic a priori knowledge that's used in the laws of physics, right? I can know that everything that I experience has a prior cause in time, right? Not because that's some metaphysical law of the universe, right? But because that's how I have to connect concepts and rules with one another, right? Okay, and so reason then is the faculty of principles. Another way of putting this is that it's the faculty of inference, right? So this is, I wrote that really bad. Inference, that's what that says. Okay, and so reason is like whenever we use syllogisms, right? We connect certain ideas or certain judgments together, right? So, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? And so reason is sort of a way of connecting judgments that we make that come from the understanding together, right? And what Kant has to say, the reason why this is a critique of pure reason, is that whenever we use reason, this faculty of inferences, on beyond our possible experience, so it's pure reason, right? Then we fall into what he calls antinomies and illusions, right? And sort of the central categories here are ideas in which he has in mind God, freedom, and then the soul. And so this is metaphysics, right? The source of synthetic a priori principles for mathematics is the form of our intuition. The source of synthetic a priori judgments for physics stems from the categories. The source of synthetic a priori judgments for metaphysics comes from ideas of reason. But these are sources of antinomies and illusion, right? Kant's idea here is basically that we correctly use certain concepts like causality, right? For any event that happens that I can perceive, right? I then infer that it had a cause, right? And Kant thinks we do that correctly, right? That's what makes laws of physics work, etc. Kant's point is that the more and more we continue to do that, eventually we will go outside of the realm of our possible experience, right? And so, whereas whenever I use causality on things that are in time, I sort of know how to apply that concept. I have an intuition that I can apply it to, right? But as we continue to go further and further, and we eventually go outside of our experience, we start asking questions like, oh, well, what caused the universe as a whole, right? Why is there something rather than nothing? This is sort of example of Leibnizian question, right? And the only way that you can answer that question, at least Leibniz says, is God, right? So this is kind of how you get traditional metaphysical inquiry, is you use the principles given here, like causality and so on, and then you infer that you can continue to use them, right, ad nauseum, until you sort of have arrived at cases where you no longer even know how to apply the concept anymore. And that's what produces illusion, right? Okay, so just as an example, so let's consider the difference between Kant and Leibniz. So for Leibniz, the principle of synthetic judgments is the principle of sufficient reason, which allows for inferences to the nature of the universe, right? So Leibniz thinks, okay, how do I discover particular things about the universe? He says, okay, well, there must be a reason why it's like that, right? And this is why he infers of the existence of God, right? Is that there has to be something to sort of like start up the finite universe that we're a part of, right? And so this is sort of like what lets him jump into metaphysics. Similarly, thinking about monads, right? How does he start the monadology? Well, he's like, well, bodies are composites. They're made of stuff, right? And so if that's true, then there must be some atoms, some like final stuff that they're made of, and those are monads, right? And then you start doing all this like crazy metaphysics about that. And the principle of sufficient reason lets you do that because it says like, okay, there must be a cause, right, for the universe. And so you have to, necessarily put someone as being that cause, right? By contrast, for Kant, we may think but never cognize beyond all possible experience, right? So I can apply the principle of sufficient reason to appearances, right? But I cannot apply it to things how they are in themselves, right? And so while Leibniz thought that the physical world around him was mere appearance, right, and their fundamental basis was sort of metaphysical, right, Kant believes to the contrary that the realm of appearances is rule governed and systematic, and we can know about it in a fundamental way, whereas we can never know beyond the realm of our possible experience to like what things would be like from the mind of God or something like that, right? And so, yeah, we had to be satisfied with our human perspective. But our human perspective does allow for more rule governedness than empiricists like Hume allow, right? There are genuine sources of synthetic a priori knowledge, right? And we need a way to sift out what makes those legitimate and what makes metaphysics illegitimate, right? And that's Kant's central task. And so for the last couple of minutes that we're here, I would like to just sort of propose something that I believe is unique to Kant, something that genuinely stamps this as a new era whenever we move beyond Kant. And that is Kant's insistence on the human standpoint, right? To some extent, we have that already in the empiricists, right? But what makes Kant unique is that Kant thinks that there are principled, elements to what it means to be human, right? That allow us to make genuine knowledge claims, even if they're true for us and they're not true in any sort of absolute sense, right? And this is Kant's transcendental idealism. He thinks it's an empirical realism. So in other words, even though we can't know the ultimate metaphysical realm of reality, the noumenal world, right? We can know the phenomenal world of appearances in a systematic way. And there's a sort of autonomy to appearances, that appearances show up in a rule-governed way that we can know systematically, right? That is not actually grounded or depend on any higher metaphysical entity or metaphysical knowledge, right? None of Kant's stuff here invokes God or God's understanding, right? Or at least uses that as a source of justification. Instead, he says, what are the kind of representations that human beings have? And how do human beings order that, right? And so this is to some extent why discussions of God begin to fall out of the picture. Why late modern philosophy is more atheistic than early modern philosophy is because it begins from this Kantian point of view where you can no longer appeal to sort of transcendent entities to explain aspects of your own experience. Human experience begins to explain itself, right? And that's the core of Kant's Enlightenment mentality. In the 19th century and the 20th century are filled with problematizations, deepenings of this kind of insight, right? To what extent is our human knowledge historical knowledge, right? Or sociological knowledge, or economic, right? And you see this developed in figures like Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, right? In the existentialist tradition that begins to think that there are unique aspects or dimensions to human existence that outstrip anything that, a theological discourse or anything like that could say about it, right? They will often point to Kant as their source, and it's because of this sort of Enlightenment mentality that we can really know ourselves and begin then to take hold of ourselves, right? To gain autonomy, a law that we apply for ourselves and to ourselves, and that's his own vision of freedom, right? And this vision of freedom was then, exemplified essentially in the French Revolution to follow. And then this becomes the basis for, a whole litany of revolutionary traditions, including like the Haitian Revolution, right? Who would appeal to the very universalistic values that Kant and company sort of went out of their way to justify and explain and do it in a really rigorous and systematic way. Okay, so that was just a little bit about future historical stuff. I really, really hope that you enjoyed this course. I will say, it's a real honor for me to be able to do it. I'm very passionate about this kind of stuff. I think it's very interesting, and I feel very grateful that you all have reflected that passion in your own engagement with the material, in the discussion board, in your midterms, in the extra credit assignments that I've graded. I very deeply appreciate that, in such a troubled time for everyone, that you all put in so much work for this class, and you made it, like I learned a lot from you all and the insights that you had. So I genuinely really appreciate that. I hope that this class is helpful. I hope that it makes you want to continue to pursue philosophy, or that if you don't, that the skills that you built here help you out in the future. Okay, remember that the final paper is due May 10th. If you need any sort of extension, please get in contact with me as soon as possible, and we can make it happen. Okay. Thanks so much. Bye.